Okay, so I am now, as my review of gameplay, so to speak, I'm going to talk about this scenario that I have been working through using the Solo Assistant, which I haven't covered in this review. Solo Assistant is, I think, very good. Um, I'm not sure if I'll get to that in this review or not, maybe near the end. But I want to talk about this scenario. It is scenario 17, The Deceived. It's a fairly big scenario. It posits that there is a pretty large force of East German units. This is a mounted infantry company or battalion or whatever the East Germans used, with some support from old T-55 tanks and some recon assets. They've got some off-board artillery and some onboard indirect fire assets, and then a formation of T-72 tanks, which are good tanks, not the best in the game by any stretch of the imagination, but they are good. And the Soviets have decided that this is an important offensive for them, so they have dedicated some support to it. Eventually, the Soviets are going to get a formation of 10 T-80 tanks, the best Warsaw Pact tanks in the game, and they're also going to get some helicopters coming in, a couple of Hind helicopters. The Americans have reinforcements coming in midway through, mounted infantry mounted on Bradleys. Now, Bradleys, as you can see here, are pretty terrific as armored fighting vehicles, thin-skinned armored fighting vehicles in this game go. They've got the TOW guided missiles for anti-tanks. They've got the 20 millimeter cannon. Look in the lower right-hand corner, the 3 with the 4. That means that in assaults or overruns, as some games would call it, they roll 3 dice needing 4s. Notably, I failed to utilize that advantage to their dismay. So the first 3 turns in this scenario are at night. The Warsaw Pact is trying to move down the map to capture this objective here, which is a bridge. This objective here, which is a bridge. You'll notice a blown bridge here. And finally, this objective here, which is simply a city. It's sort of like if they get this objective, they are, they've captured the entire area that they're responsible for. The American forces are pretty thin here. They have a company of M60 tanks as a last line of defense. They have a company of Abrams tanks and that are tasked with defending this objective, and this company is tasked with defending, by the scenario, tasked with defending this objective. And then they have a mixed force which has an Abrams and some infantry and a mortar and this really cool M901 ITV vehicle, which also has the TOW anti-tank guided missile. And so I had the Solo system play the Americans, but I had to decide the setup. Some of it was dictated by scenario. So I decided that this tank company here was tasked with defending this bridge, so they were going to set up here, sort of behind cover. Upon reflection, I wish I had done that differently, but that's what I did. And the M60s are just down here trying to project as much fire as those tanks are capable of out there. They're reasonably potent. 4 dice needing 5s to hit at a range of 11. Let's compare that to the Abrams. I have to say, I'm a little surprised to see the firepower is the same. Did they use the same gun? Well, I do not know. In any case, so there's a couple of infantry here and a couple of M113 vehicles. So I decided that this American formation, which had flexibility in setup, would take a position here in the center and try to sort of be flexible to respond to whichever axis of advance needed the most protection. And what I'm having the East Germans do is the tank formation is coming down this road to try to capture this objective, which the Americans are basically ceding, and the infantry, much larger force, is coming down this way. They're going to try to capture this. Excuse me. and then they'll both try to converge and take the final objective. So the first two turns, very little happens because it's just the East Germans moving down the map as fast as they can. Starting in turn 3 here, some things have cooked up. The East German tanks have come down and crossed this bridge and crossed into this city and prepared to try to move up on the American defenders here. But between the Dragon anti-tank guided missile and the Abrams tank up here, they have managed to disrupt and reduce pretty noticeably the East German tanks. So that just goes to show you that the American technological advantage, along with multiple formation activations, tends to work pretty well. And the mortar over here has also taken part in the fire. And the East German infantry is moving a little bit slowly. The East Germans have a designated formation card. They use that on their tanks. So at the end of turn 3, not much has changed. And as we get into turn 4, now we see the American reinforcements have entered the map. And as I said, the Bradleys have quite a lot of firepower, and they come in also with an anti-aircraft unit and a self-propelled mortar, and the Bradleys with infantry support. And so they make a push to take this bridge back and sort of trapping the T-72s on the wrong side of the river. What I should have done was either brought the Americans in here to help bolster this defense. That would probably been the smartest thing, or use the Bradleys' ability to be lethal in assault. I did not do either of those things, but the initial wave of American reinforcements really kind of hampered the East German plans. It caused some losses, caused some disruption, and caused them to stop their advance. So the thing I say I like the most about this game is the narrative. So here come the East Germans, very superior in numbers. They've been bloodied some by the Americans, but they should have enough of a force to push the Americans off this ridge. But then out of nowhere, here comes the cavalry, right? Now, it turns out that the cavalry came in a little too fast and furious for its own good, which we're going to see in a little while. But when it first shows up, it's pretty disruptive. So my take on what happened here was the American reinforcements were making their way to the battle. They heard about the fighting. Maybe they had some intel that they should take up a defensive position farther south, but they decided, no, forget about that. We have an opportunity to flank the enemy and inflict casualties on them with audacity and high amounts of firepower, and so we're going to do that. So their commander, of his own initiative, charged right into the heart of the fight, and things looked pretty good at first. You see the East German infantry is still moving pretty slowly. They're not making a lot of headway, and the East German tanks are in some trouble. So any designated formation cards that get pulled, which in my mind is the notion of command and control assets, resupply, just a general focus on dealing with this area of conflict, keeps the East German infantry a little bit slower. So this American plan seems to have been relatively good. We're going to find out that's not the case. And here is what has happened in the subsequent turns. The East Germans came roaring back at the Americans with their T-72 tanks, and also had a nice airstrike come in. And so I've talked about the objective cards in this game and how that's the wrong pop-up, how they affect things, the order in which they get pulled. So let's take a look at what has happened up here. So this is in reverse order of activation. Oh, I was wrong. The airstrike hasn't come in yet. It's going to come in later. So the American infantry force defending in the center was activated, but it didn't have much to do. The American reinforcements got an activation early on and did their thing, and then the Russians were able to activate both the tank formation and the infantry formation. This blue formation here of the Americans is the M60 Pattons way down south. There's nothing for them to do. And this formation here is the Americans defending the farthest right objective, and they don't have too much to do now either. So we've basically had one relevant American activation followed by two East German activations, and what is coming next is going to be sort of the final blow on the Americans. You see here, they've got their infantry with some good anti-tank weapons here. They've got their Bradleys, a little bit of disruption. But look up here. These T-72 tanks are about to roll through and crush these vehicles here. And the Bradleys here, one of them is disrupted. The infantry is kind of trapped here, far away from things. And there's a bunch of T-72 tanks very close proximity to these American forces. So that's not a great position for the Americans to be in at this point. They're down to 3 Bradleys. One of them is reduced. One of them is disrupted. And so what happens after that? This looks like exactly the same file. What happens after that is this. The Russians wrecked the American sort of auxiliary units up here, had a couple of Bradleys here reduced, and we did have an airstrike at this point. The Bradleys that were here, the one Bradley unit that was here got wrecked, and there's an American infantry unit sitting in a field surrounded by German tanks. They must be pretty scared right now. And the American headquarters is suppressed, which means at this formation's next activation, they won't have a lot of ability to coordinate things. So this is the very middle of the 5th turn of the game, and you can see that while all that's happening, the East German infantry continues to advance slowly, and also Russian helicopters have entered the fray, and they have managed to completely eliminate one Abrams, which is a huge part of the American defense of this objective here, and they're hovering around here looking to deal some more damage. So the Americans looked like they had gained some momentum with the arrival of reinforcements, but then it seems like they probably squandered those forces. The Soviets, or the Warsaw Pact, the East Germans, are just continuing to grind. And when we get over here further along in turn 5, an interesting thing happened. You'll notice that the American reinforcements company had gotten an order to activate, and the headquarters did make it back in, and there were 2 reduced Bradleys up in here, and the solo assistant told them to move towards the objective, so they came and ran and took this objective. Now you've got 2 reduced Bradley platoons and a very disrupted and terrified infantry platoon. It's been disrupted over here forever, facing off against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 platoons of T-72. So this reminds me of the final battle in Saving Private Ryan, right, where this very tiny beleaguered American force has to try to fend off a whole bunch of German tanks that are trying to capture a bridge so that they can get across a river for a counterattack. And the Americans are still holding firm here, but things are starting to look a little bit grim. And now turn 6 sees this development. The Bradleys have been finally eliminated, as we knew they would. They have caused some disruption in the East German ranks, but the East Germans still haven't suffered too many casualties. The lone American infantry platoon that was stuck up here in this hill got reduced, but managed to retreat into the woods, and it's got its headquarters unit with it, and it's got its TOW anti-tank guided missiles. So I think of this as being a ragtag force of survivors that have scrounged together, and there's maybe a corporal who's leading this small bit of a platoon at this point after all the losses they've suffered. And there aren't many men left, but they've still got a powerful anti-tank weapon, and combined with this Abrams up on this hill with some indirect fire support, they could still cause a problem for the East Germans. The Soviets are making their way down now. Their tanks have arrived, and the American helicopter reinforcements have arrived. But in this scenario, the American helicopters are by default suffering pilot fatigue, and so they only get one formation card, which means the Soviets who have a designated formation can probably activate about twice as often. So these Cobras here are trying to slow the Soviet reinforcements down, because if this fresh group of tanks makes it all the way down, that'll be bad. But look, the Cobras have caused one wreck. They've wrecked a platoon. But the Soviets are looking to just race right by them and try to maybe draw the Cobras into anti-aircraft fire from this East German unit. And the long, slow column approach of the East German infantry continues, as does harassment from the Soviet helicopters. So I'm going to talk about turn 7, the last turn in the game, and hope that I've given you a flavor of why I consider this game to be so much fun and so interesting to play in terms of what you can think about happening out there on the map. So as turn 7 begins, the Warsaw Pact is starting to look a little bit more potent. They have moved their infantry in close to their objective. They've dropped a smoke screen. They do have a problem with this pretty potent anti-tank unit and this mortar able to inflict fire on them, when you can see they disrupted this unit. But they still have these helicopters out here, and the helicopters, well, you can see right here, the Hind helicopters, when they hover, they have a very powerful anti-tank capability, and so the American tanks, without very much anti-aircraft support, are in some trouble down here as a result of these helicopters. And the Americans in the center are still holding steady. This infantry unit here could mount a support weapon at some point if it needs to start firing on an infantry advance. But the infantry is getting pretty close to being in a position to march down here and come for this bridge. And the Pact has completely taken control of this objective here, and it will have no problem with it. And if they can move their T-80s down here and through the East Germans, they're going to probably scatter this American force and make it run back, and have to try to decide, will it try to defend this city to keep them from crossing here and making a maneuver in this direction, because they can't really cross here, so that's the only choice, right, is to try to stop them here, and then hopefully time will run out or something before they can make it all the way down here. And so, and the American reinforcements have been pretty shredded. And so the advance is proceeding apace. And now formation activations now become super important. Who goes first starts to matter a lot. And what happens is the East Germans end up with some pretty fortunate circumstances. They bring their Soviet tanks down. They move the East Germans out of the way. So the East Germans have suffered losses. They're disrupted. They're in bad shape. But there's this giant formation with 9 T-80 platoons, only one of which is reduced, about to roll through this city and come after this, smallish force here. But they are holding tough, right? They're not. They're no cowards, and as they're doing that, the East German infantry has begun to dismount. They've dropped the second smoke screen down here. Their plan is to move this way. The Russian helicopters, failed their reload roll, so they get this helicopter formation gets only one more shot. In a hilarious example of my own flakiness, this Russian helicopter actually fired on and destroyed an East German transport after spending 5 minutes discussing how to avoid anti-aircraft fire from the East German anti-aircraft unit. That was such a good example of myself not paying attention to things that I left that result in. But the East Germans have sent a part of their infantry force in this direction. And the other thing they've done is made excellent use of their indirect fire assets. They have brought some off-board high explosive artillery down on these American defenders and utilized their mortar, their 82 millimeter mortar, and their self-propelled artillery platoon to disrupt all of these American defenders, making them very vulnerable to assault. When you assault, you get the lower right corner, 2 dice needing 4s, but when you're disrupted, you get the correct number of dice, but you need a 6 to hit. So this East German infantry, when it assaults here, is going to assault with 2 dice needing 4 and be attacked back with 3 dice needing 6. And so all hits there's no saves for hits in assault. The assault is like close quarters, hand to hand kind of combat, very close in, and so all hits are applied, but fire is simultaneous, and whichever side applies the most hits wins, and it keeps the hex. And so the odds are pretty good for this for this West German infantry unit to dislodge the American infantry here. And also these armored fighting vehicles, thin-skinned, are at a big disadvantage in the city and are both disrupted and aren't very good at defending against assaults anyway. And there's another unit of East German infantry that can come down here for the assault. And so that's what the East Germans have planned. And because the Americans are disrupted and ops complete over here and disrupted over here, they can't really interdict this movement with fire of any kind. And even over here, the Abrams, which could fire across the ridge here, is ops complete. And so the East German infantry has pretty much free reign, and they still have the BMP-2, which is a powerful weapon, and their little anti-tank scout car, as well as another BMP-2. So they're looking poised to push this American flank defense out of the way and be able to focus on trying to take this bridge. And indeed, that is what happens. Should have gotten these maps all set up before I started the video. What happens, the rest of this infantry formation's activation ends up with them having assaulted and driven the American defenders back. They are now a hex back in the city, and the East Germans don't care about taking this city. They've got these Americans pinned here. They can't do anything more to try to help support this defense here. And they've also brought a lot of units up pretty close to this tank formation, which will probably activate sooner than the East German infantry will, but it's probably got little choice now except to withdraw and try to fall back and aid in the defense of the final objective. So that's happened early on in the turn, and the next thing that happens here is the East Germans finally eliminate these American units that were pestering them from the trees over here, and they get their entire T-80 formation across. And so now, except for this unit up here, so now the Soviets have all of these tanks. The Warsaw Pact has all of these tanks here, some of which are disrupted. Some of those will make rallies, some of them won't, facing off against basically an Abrams and an infantry unit with a Dragon, which, isn't going to do a lot against the reactive armor of the Soviets. They don't have the reactive armor, right? What do they have, Chabam armor or something? Anyway, so it's looking like the Americans better hope that they activate first and mount their troops up and get on out of Dodge and see if they can get into good defensive positions down here before the Soviets are able to roll up on them. But if the Soviets pull the designated formation card, they could end up pinning the American units up here. That would be very bad. And so what happens after that? So what happens after that is you've got the American commanders screaming for support, probably like if you saw the Mel Gibson movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, where he stares right at the camera and yells, "We are Broken Arrow!" It was a terrible scene. There's a great book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Fantastic book, one of the best I've ever read. The movie didn't do it justice. But you've got this guy here probably saying, hey, we really need some help down here. And what did the Americans do? They send in the A-10 on a strike mission, right, to try to relieve the pressure. And so they target the headquarters tank of the Soviet advance, and they so 6 dice needing threes to hit for high explosive. So the A-10 is an anti-tank platform, right? That's what it's good for. So it rolls in, it makes its saves against anti-aircraft fire, and it makes its attack run, and it just goes the whole 9 yards against the Russian formation here, and it ends up. I'm just going to leave it magnified here. The Cobras, you see how they have fallen way behind. They just can't keep up with only one activation. But look at this. Where once were 2 full-strength platoons of T-80s and the formation headquarters is now just a giant smoldering pile of wrecked vehicles and dead Soviet soldiers. And what that means, not only does that mean that they've reduced this force significantly, that's not nearly as relevant as the fact that the Russian tank, as well as the East German infantry, or the East German tank commanders, are now both suppressed. So at each of those formations' next formation draw, they're going to have to make command checks for all of their units. And what that means is they're not going to be able to make any kind of coordinated effort to move here. So that lone American airstrike came in and completely changed the tenor of things down here. The Americans are still in a bad situation, but they probably have time now to pull back and take up some defensive positions down here. And so, and the Warsaw Pact still has a long way to go. They have to get across the river here. They don't have bridging units, so they could also come all the way across this way and cross this bridge here. But one way or the other, they've got to get across this river system, and then down across this bridge and take this hex here. And this is how far they've gone in 7 turns now, and they've got 4 turns left. So are they going to be able to do that? I don't know. Meanwhile, the this Hind helicopter unleashed its final barrage of anti-tank missiles and wrecked another Abrams platoon, and so this American unit also really needs to skedaddle. It's just one tank. Look at all of these enemy around it. Almost certainly it will activate before the East Germans have a chance to do anything, which would be good because if they can get back to here, at least they're safe from fire, but they're still going to have to be taking fire as they flee. And so they need to come back here and try to bolster the defense of this final objective. And so, I don't know, did I do a good job of demonstrating how the orders of formation activations, the vagaries of command roles, the battlefield chaos plays itself out in this game so effectively. Now, I've done a pretty bad job, I think, of setting up the American defense, and I've made a lot of mistakes with the Warsaw Pact advance. I don't think I'm playing this game all that well, but I think I am having a ton of fun with it and really enjoying what strikes me as a game that creates a powerful narrative and a great flavor. I mean, isn't this what we thought World War III was going to be if it happened in 1985? Hordes of Soviet and their allied units storming across fields into the teeth of American firepower advantage and just trying to use numbers to overwhelm them. And what we hoped was we would be able to use air power to slow their advance enough to let our advantage in technology and command and control provide enough of a backbone to keep them from overrunning all of West Germany in time for American resupply efforts. If you've played the game Blue Water Navy, it's a great adjunct to this. Can we get the supplies across, right? So it just creates, I mean, if you read Red Storm Rising, it creates that thing, right? Like, could this be that one tank commander who was the hero of part of that story, right? Could this be the Soviet Politburo members' son's unit trying to charge down and take command? All kinds of things like that going on. So yeah, all right. So that's my quasi video review of World at War 85 Storming the Gap, focusing on reviewing gameplay and the way this game creates a powerful narrative. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. Now I'll have to get back to finishing my solo scenario.